Hey there, all you pixies and peeps. Thanks for joining me here at the Purple Pixie. And welcome, or welcome back, to the Fairy Garden, which is what I call my craft room. If you're new here, here's a little bit of what I do. DIYs and tutorials on home decor, dupes, and flips. My favorite is true trash to treasure, and I love craft stash busting. And when it comes to style, I'm very eclectic. My favorite is shabby chic, but I also do farmhouse, boho, rustic, industrial, glam, modern, and classic. As a pixie, I always try to make a little magic. However, I'm very good at making a few mishaps. But I invite you to let me know what you think in the comments down below. So without further ado, let me wave my little wand and let's try to make some of that magic. Today's video is about farmhouse miniatures. It's part of a collaboration hosted by Crafted by Corie for her monthly minis challenge, but we'll talk more about that later. Let's get into project number 1, Farmer John's Barn. If you happen to have a wooden shaped house, you could very well use that for the barn, but I didn't. So I took this piece of MDF board, wrote out my measurements, and used my jigsaw to cut out the shape of the barn. Feel free to pause the video and screenshot these measurements, as well as these that I made for my friends that use the metric system. Now once I had my barn shape cut out, I just went around the edges with a little sandpaper to smooth it out so I didn't get any splinters. And then I went in with my eraser to erase all my pencil marks so that they wouldn't show through when I painted it. And then once my piece was all prepared, I gave it 2 good coats with the folk art chalk paint in the color Imperial, making sure to get the sides, the edges, and the back. For the trim of the barn, as well as the doors and the hayloft, I'm using my white Adirondack folk art chalk paint to paint a few skewers that I will cut down to size later on. Now to make the hayloft door, I'm taking a jumbo-sized craft stick, measuring down about 1.5 inches, and I'll be cutting 2 pieces that size. And now I'm going to take those pieces and glue them onto this old Coke box. I'm gluing one piece right along a fold line in the box. That way I can use it like a hinge on a door. And once they're both glued on, I'm going to cut them out, including a little extra lip past the fold line. And just like the rest of the barn, I give the whole thing 2 coats of the folk art chalk paint in the color Imperial. Now moving on to the door of the barn. Here are the measurements that we need to make the door. I'm using the same old Coke box, and using those measurements, I drew a rectangle onto the box, again along one of the fold lines. Then it was just a simple matter of giving it a few coats of paint and cutting it out. Now what would any barn be without an old rusted tin roof? So I took an empty Coke can, I cut off the top and the bottom, and I'm going to paint the rest of it to make it look like a galvanized rusted roof. I roughed it up a little bit with some sandpaper And now I'm going to sponge paint it. I must warn you that the edges are very, very sharp, so you may want to use gloves if you do this. But I'm just taking an old makeup sponge and dabbing on some gray paint. That color was Timeless Gray by Apple Barrel. And now I'm going to go back in with a darker color gray called Antique Nickel, and it's by Anita's All-Purpose Acrylic. While that is still wet, I come in with some ground cinnamon, dip my makeup sponge in it, and dab it all over the paint. This gives it that great rusted look, and by the way, smells awesome. Once that paint is all dry, I cut it into strips that would fit across the top of the roof of my barn. Then I cut it into little squares and started gluing them on so that they overlapped each other, kind of like a tin roof. I love the sound of rain hitting a tin roof. What about you? Let me know down in the comments below. Once I have both sides covered with my tin shingles, I'm going to fold one in half and put it right on the top in the middle. Now it's time to take those skewers that we painted white and glue them all around the frame of the barn. Rather than measure them out, I'm just going to lay them up against the barn and use my wire cutters to cut them to the length that I need. I did this for the whole barn, and I made a frame for the door and the hayloft door as well. Now it's time to glue the door and the hayloft door onto the barn. And as I mentioned before, we're using the fold in the cardboard box as the hinge. So that is the part that we're going to glue onto the barn itself. I think this little barn is turning out so adorable, but I'm going to take it up one little notch. I have a bunch of raffia on hand, which who doesn't, right? But I'm going to cut it into small little pieces, and I'm going to glue that inside the hayloft door. That way it looks like there's a little bit of hay up in the loft. And then I got another bright idea, which doesn't happen to me too often, so I was pretty proud of it. I took these blocks that I got from Dollar Tree, and I'm going to put some hot glue on a couple sides and dip them in the raffia. And I just keep repeating that step until the entire cube is covered with raffia. Trim it down, and boom, I got some hay bales. Now, in hindsight, I should have used a small bowl rather than a cup to put the raffia in. But it all worked out, and I was happy with the end result. Pretty cute, right? Well, I thought so. Now to make sure my barn doesn't fall over, I'm gluing a regular sized Jenga block to the back of it, and I'm just going to give that a coat of paint as well to make sure it matches. Now, every good barn needs a weather vane, right? However, my camera decided to flop out on me, so I wasn't able to film this part, but I did take some stills. Now, depending on how old you are, you may or may not remember this thing called shrinky dinks. It's basically a plastic sheet that you cut into shapes, put it in the oven, and they shrink down in size. But did you know that you could cut shrinky dinks out with your Cricut or Silhouette? So I pulled up a couple of chickens in my Silhouette studio, set my machine to cut out shrink plastic, and then just ran it through my Silhouette and cut it out. I did have some trouble popping out the shapes, so I would recommend using a deep cut blade and going over it a few times. In fact, the beaks ripped off of both pieces, but I was able to go in and fix it with my scissors. Put them in the oven, shrunk them down, and voila! I have a weather vane. From there, all I had to do was put the chicken on a paper clip. I was going to put the arrow on there too, but I ended up breaking it in the process and just decided to go with the chicken. Now if you like, you can glue your paper clip straight down the back of the barn. But I bent mine into an L shape and I'm going to slip it into the top shingle on the roof. This little weather vane is the perfect touch to Farmer John's barn. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it's part of a minis challenge that happens the third Friday of each month, hosted by Crafted by Corie. Each month is a different theme, and as you may have guessed it, this month's theme is Farmhouse. If you've never seen Crafted by Corie, I highly recommend you go check out her channel. She's very talented, creative, and she's awesome at what she does. You can find the link to her channel, as well as the link to this playlist, in my description box below. And if you should happen to want to join in on the minis challenge, here are the rules for each month. Stay tuned to Corie's channel to find out the upcoming themes for the upcoming months. But for now, let's move on to project number 2, the old oak tree. Now looking at the amount of materials this one takes, you would think it was complicated, but really any beginner can do it. All you need is some wooden beads, a styrofoam ball, toilet paper tube, some Spanish moss and rocks, some jute twine, a small plastic lid. This one came from a small microwavable SpaghettiOs, a scrap piece of fabric, and of course some hot glue and scissors. Now let me begin by apologizing for this project because a lot of it, unfortunately, was filmed out of frame. No technical difficulties of my camera, more along the lines of technical difficulties by me. So what you can't see right here is the fact that I'm making a tree trunk out of the toilet paper tube. And now I'm going to glue some of the small rocks inside the plastic lid. This is going to give my trunk something stable to stand up on. And now to give the trunk a bit of texture, I'm going to wrap the entire thing with the jute twine, just down to the bottom, where you can see that I have cut some flaps in the bottom of the toilet paper tube. Those flaps are going to be what I glue onto the top of the plastic lid. Next, we're going to make the actual tree. I used a styrofoam ball and I glued on a few small Christmas ornaments. And now I'm sporadically gluing the beads and the half beads all over the styrofoam ball. Even though I'm going to cover this entire thing with Spanish moss, I don't want any of the wood pieces showing through. So I give it a good coat of paint in the color Irish by Folk Art Chalk Paint. This color may seem a little bright, but trust me, you're not really going to see it when it's done. Make sure you get full coverage by pouncing your brush in and out of the little cracks and crevices between the beads. Then we move back to the tree trunk. I painted the whole thing in the color Java by Folk Art Chalk Paint. And without letting that dry, I went in with some Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel. I just kind of haphazardly slapped it on there, and it blended in with the wet Java paint really well. However, if your first layer of paint is a little too dry, you can always go in with a wet paper towel or even a baby wipe and just smear it around until it blends. Adding layers of paint that are different shades of the same color will give it more dimension and make it look more realistic. And so for our last shade of paint, we're going to use the color Oatmeal, also by Folk Art Chalk Paint. And just as we did with the Territorial Beige, I'm just going to slap it on there here and there and let it blend in with the wet paint underneath it. Ideally, since we're making a tree, I should have used some green moss. However, I couldn't find any. So I'm going to use this Spanish moss, which makes one hell of a mess, but at least this time I'm cutting it over a bowl instead of a cup. I'm chopping it up really fine because, well, we're making a small scale tree, not a large topiary. So I want all these little pieces to fit in the nooks and crannies of the beads that we glued onto the styrofoam ball. As usual, it wouldn't be a Purple Pixie video without at least one or two fails, so here we go. I'm going to try and cover this tree with Elmer's school glue, and then dip it in the moss, and in theory the moss should stick to the glue, right? Well, just keep watching and let's see how that turns out. Some of the moss did stick, but when I went back in for a second round, it was just falling off all over the place. So I considered that a fail and decided to just go in with my hot glue gun and make it a little bit easier on myself. I mean, life is hard enough as it is, right? I sure as heck don't need to be making it any harder. And this technique worked out really well once I got it all glued down and trimmed up. Now that the tree trunk is dry, I'm going to glue it to the top of the plastic lid and then cover it with that felt. In order to wrap the felt around the trunk, I'm just going to cut a slit, and then I'll trace the circumference of the trunk in the middle of the felt. Now, in hindsight, I should have traced this onto the felt before I glued the trunk to the plastic lid. But it's okay, it all worked out just fine. Now I cut that circle out, and I'm going to fit it around the trunk and glue it to the plastic lid. Again, I must express my apologies for being out of frame, but you can pretty much get the idea of what I'm doing. Besides, I'm a crafter, not a photographer. But since you have to be both when you have a crafting YouTube channel, I promise I'm going to work better on being in frame more in the future. Once I have all the edges glued down to the plastic lid, you just give it a little trim around the edges, and it's all ready to glue your Spanish moss onto. Now I would love to show you how I painted that Spanish moss, but again, I had some technical difficulties. But here are some still shots and I can explain what I did. For the treetop, I went in with some Kelly Green apple barrel acrylic paint and pounced it all over the Spanish moss. I followed that up with another coat of the celery and Waverly chalk paint, and this is how it turned out. I glued some Spanish moss onto the bottom of the tree trunk, but I didn't paint that green. And a last minute decision, I used my leafy garland to wrap around the tree to give it some, well, leaves. And here's how it turned out. Pretty cute, I think. I just want to take one more second to tell Corie thank you for hosting this minis challenge. I've always loved miniatures since I can remember, even as a little girl when I used to decorate my Barbie dream house with little miniature furniture pieces and such, so I really have fun with this challenge. Now let's get into project number 3, which is a rustic windmill. Now I'm going to be using some more of that tin that we used from the soda can earlier. And since the edges of that tin can be pretty sharp, and sharp things and me don't really get along, I decided it would be safer to make a template out of cardboard. I tried finding a windmill printable online, but I just couldn't find one that I was happy with. So I used a tape dispenser to draw a circle, and then I'm going to freehand a blade. Now if I can draw this, I know you can. It's a simple step of 2 straight lines, one longer than the other, and then connect the 2 with a line that kind of curves in the middle. And you only have to draw one. You cut that out and use that as a template to draw all the blades on the windmill. You may be able to skip this step of drawing it onto the cardboard, but for me, I found it safer to just trace it out like this, cut out a template, and then trace that onto the tin. Being a diabetic, I have to prick my fingers several times a day as it is to check my blood sugar. And since I'm on blood thinners as well, the last thing I need to do is slice my hand open and have a nice big mess to clean up. Since I can't get this soda can to lay flat, I'm just going to use a couple of pieces of packing tape and tape each end down to my mat. Then I can put my template on there and trace it with no problem. And let's not forget about the little rudder for the windmill. So I went back in with my template, traced out another fan blade, but this time I made it a little bit wider and a little bit longer. I'm going to use this skewer to connect it to the windmill, so I'm just measuring out how long I need my skewer to be. I need to put a brad in the middle of my windmill. So I took this tool that I have and it punched a hole in the middle. I'm not really sure what this tool is supposed to do. I found it in my mom's stash when she passed away. I think it's supposed to be used for setting snaps in fabric, but like I said, I'm not sure. What I am sure of is it's great for punching holes in thin materials like this, which is what I use it for all the time. If you know what it is, please leave me a comment down below. Meanwhile, I'm going to be out of frame again as I put this brad in the hole. I promise I am not trying to hide anything from you. I just don't know how to work in front of a camera yet. For instance, I didn't show you me gluing 2 popsicle sticks to the windmill blades, but I did. So now it is time to paint the windmill and make it look old and rustic. And I'm doing the same thing that I did to make the tin roof. I'm going in with the Timeless Gray by Apple Barrel. Then I will follow that up with a coat of the Antique Nickel, and then pounce some more cinnamon on it to give it that rusted look. Remember to put the cinnamon on while the paint is still wet, otherwise it won't adhere. Now I painted some skewer sticks the same way that I painted the entire windmill. These are going to be the lattice braces for the windmill structure. I just cut them down to size where I wanted them and then simply glued them on with some hot glue. Now of course I had some hot glue seepage, but that's an easy fix. You just use some tweezers, hold your piece down, and scrape away the hot glue. It helps if the hot glue is still warm, but even if it's dry, it still works. If you want to warm up the hot glue, you can always use a heat gun or even a blow dryer. This little tip comes in handy, especially if you're like me and tend to glue things in the wrong spot. You can just heat up the glue, remove your piece, put it where you want it, and scrape away the excess glue. Now for the X-shaped brace, I simply measured my pieces, cut them down to size, glued them in place. But because I didn't want the pieces to overlap and lie flat instead, I had to cut 2 smaller pieces to fit in between that crossbar. And here it is. Not perfect, but by all means rustic. Now that third popsicle stick, we're going to glue right onto the brad. That way it can fold flat or fold out, making it into a kind of stand or tripod of some sort. And last of all, we need to cut out our rudder. I already painted one, so I'm just going to cut that one out, glue it to the skewer stick, and then glue the skewer stick to the back of the windmill. I love this little windmill. It turned out absolutely precious, and it makes the perfect addition to my little farmhouse tiered tray. So are you ready to see how they all look? Good, because here comes the final reveal. So now that you've seen them all, what do you think? Were they magic or mishaps? Please let me know in the comments down below. I also would like to invite you to subscribe to my channel. I'd love it if you became part of the Pixie Party. And then make sure to ring my bell and click all so you'll know every time I upload a new video. Giving me a big thumbs up and sharing my video really helps my channel to grow, so I would appreciate your support. If you're already a part of the Pixie Party, I want to welcome you back and tell you how thankful I am for your support also. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with this. First impressions count, but what others think of you is none of your business. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember that all of me loves all of you.